Welcome to episode 2 of the APS Stamp Chat. I'm Scott English, Executive Director of the American Philatelic Society. Joining me is someone who has come a long way in the hobby over the past few years, Charles Epting, presenting treasures from the Erivan Collection. Recently named as one of Lynn's Stamp News' most influential philatelists, Charles Epting first began collecting stamps while a student at the University of Southern California. An alumnus of the APS's Young Philatelic Leaders Fellowship, he joined the H.R. Harmer team in early 2016 and is now president. His articles have appeared in the American Philatelist, Lynn's Stamp News, The Chronicle, the American Stamp Collector and Dealer, and other philatelic publications. He has given numerous presentations, including the Collectors Club of New York and the APS Tiffany Talk. Since 2020, Charles has served as co-host of the podcast Conversations with Philatelists alongside Michael Cortese. Epting also currently serves as the secretary of the American Philatelic Research Library and has previously served on the board of the United States Philatelic Classic Society. In his limited free time, Charles is currently restoring his 1857 home in Dutchess County. For those watching the presentation live, your microphone and camera are disabled during the presentation. To engage fellow attendees, please make comments in the chat section. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the presentation. If you're watching this as a recording, please feel free to ask questions in the comment section. This program is provided thanks to the APS member support. If you're not already a member of the APS or would like more information about our services, please visit our website at stamps.org. Charles, welcome to Stamp Chat, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Scott. I appreciate it. That's the most formal introduction I think you've ever given me.
That's fairly accurate, yes.
Perfect. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining me here tonight. This is a talk that I gave about a month and a half ago at Pikes for the first time, and we were very happy with the response that we received, my team and I. But our only regret was that we weren't able to have more people in the room. There was a great crowd there, but obviously not everyone can make it to San Francisco. So Scott graciously invited me to give the talk virtually, and it's even more exciting now because the sale that many of these covers will be coming up in is just about a week. I'm sorry, 2 weeks away, just 15 days from today. So without further ado, I'm gonna sort of dig into treasures from the Erivan collection. There's gonna be sort of 3 parts. The first, I want to focus on Erivan Haub himself, the collector who put together this incredible holding of American postal history. Then I'm going to talk about the sales of the Erivan collection that myself and my team at H.R. Harmer have held over the last 4.5 years. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about just a couple of treasures from our upcoming sales. These are items that are not necessarily the most expensive items, not necessarily the rarest, but items that I think have great stories, items that have really talked to me and captivated my imagination, and hopefully will do the same for you. So to begin, Erivan Haub is a name that's maybe not well known to many American collectors. He was a German business magnate. He was a very serious philatelist and a philanthropist, but he wasn't all that active in America during his lifetime. A lot of times you'll see references in the literature to stamps and covers that ended up in a German collection, sort of these euphemisms referring to the Erivan Haub collection without naming him by name during his lifetime. Like I said, also a wonderful philanthropist. I'll get to that in a second, but Mr. Haub was born in Wiesbaden, Germany in 1932, and he worked at A&P supermarkets in the United States basically after high school. He was sent to La Habra in Southern California, not far from where I grew up, and he was stocking shelves at A&P supermarkets. Even though he was inheriting this substantial fortune, his family wanted to make sure he understood the value of a dollar and didn't just, come into power without any hard work. So he started at the bottom of the food chain and really worked his way up, eventually earned an economics degree from the University of Hamburg, and then began managing the Tengelmann Group, which is supermarkets, hardware stores, clothing stores. To this day, one of the largest German firms. He supported a number of social and cultural projects, including art museums across the U.S. and Germany. In Tacoma, Washington, there's an entire wing of an art museum just dedicated to his Western American art, everyone from George Catlin and Remington on up. And he passed away at the age of 85 in 2018. I was fortunate enough to meet Mr. Haub at the New York 2016 show. It was my first and only encounter with him, but his wife, Helga, is still sharp as a tack. She's one of the loveliest women that I've ever known, and she's still going strong. So his love of philately started as a young boy, like it does for many people, but it wasn't until he started working his way up in the business world that he had the disposable income to explore philately deeper. I remember him saying that the first stamp he ever bought was a Bavaria #1, the famous One Kreutzer Black. He was taken by this stamp. It's one of those ones that I think a lot of children would love to acquire, but know that they can't until they're in a slightly better position in life. So he started with that and developed this into an absolutely world-class collection of postal history, not just of the United and Confederate States, but also Switzerland, Germany, German states, Austria, Zeppelin flights, Lombardy, Venetia, as well as just other assorted worldwide rarities. Anything that caught his eye that he had to have, he basically had it. He always sought, significant stamps and covers, and connected them to historical events through postal history. He was very much of the mindset that these are, living, breathing historical relics more than just little pieces of paper. I think he was really able to contextualize these things, and his upbringing, his formative years spent in America gave him an appreciation for American history, especially these romantic concepts, whether it's the Pony Express or the Civil War, these big ticket things that we learn about in history class. He was just absolutely taken by. And here's a great quote from him. He said, "As the offspring of an old merchant family whose company was founded in 1867, trade has always been in my blood, trading, bartering, and collecting. Beauty and rarity were particularly important to me, so that almost all these objects not only gave me great pleasure, but also are also of lasting value to me." So a real collector's collector, not somebody who, viewed these as investments or commodities, but really one of us, just with the means to collect in a way that few of us will ever be able to. Again, his connection to United States postal history, his years working at an A&P supermarket had a great impact on him. He was captivated by Pony Express, Civil War, and the Gold Rush. And again, this collecting extended into his love of art as well. He and his wife owned a buffalo ranch in Wyoming. I think sometimes it takes an outsider to make you appreciate your own history, more than you do. I know from talking to all my friends who live in New York, none of us really go to the Statue of Liberty or Empire State Building unless someone comes in from out of town. And I think that Mr. Haub's perspective as an outsider certainly allowed him to view American history, in a way that maybe we take for granted more often than not. Moving on to the Erivan Sales themselves, Mr. Haub's collection is such that it could not be sold over the course of one or a couple of auctions. We decided that this is something that had to be done methodically over the course of about 5 years. So we began in earnest. The first sort of minor Erivan sale was at New York 2016, just a couple of weeks after I had joined the Harmer firm. But the major sales started in June of 2019. You can see there, we sold the Alexandria Blue Boy, hammer price of $1 million, which it's one of the most iconic items in American philately. We wanted to kick off the sales on a high note. So that was lot one of the first sale. Part two, 6 months later, that's the large Beaumont Confederate provisional on cover. Part three, that is the Lockport, New York provisional, also unique, like the large Beaumont and the Alexandria Blue Boy. Part four, that is the Livingston pair on cover, one of the most gorgeous Confederate provisionals. Part five was a Millbury provisional. Part six, that is a Pony Express envelope addressed to the Honorable Abraham Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois. It was in August of 1860, so a couple of months before the general election. During that time, Lincoln became something of a recluse back home in Illinois. Not much correspondence to or from him at that point, not many public speeches. I can only imagine what was going through his head on the eve of that, monumental election, and certainly what came just a short time into his presidency. Part seven, we actually had two sales. The first featured the incredible Waterbury running chickens, which I was lucky enough to speak about in Waterbury just last month. And you can also see there was a sale of New York fancy cancellations, including the Chittenden Eagle, unique cancellation, arguably the most beautiful, maybe inarguably the most beautiful fancy cancellation of all time. Part seven, that was in January of this year. That is a Pony Express cover with a beautiful patriotic design printed in San Francisco very early in the war. and that brought an extraordinary price of nearly $500,000. And that brings us to June and July of this year. We're selling the 9th part of the Erivan collection, and these big sales, these big numbered sales, we like to have a little bit of a lot of different things. So we want them to have some US provisionals, some Confederate provisionals, some locals and carriers, Pony Expresses, fancy cancels, you name it, runs the gamut of postal history. But we also like to do these more specialized focus sales, which is why we did the New York fancy cancel sale. It's why we're doing a sale of just Western postal history as well. That's going to be in early July. And again, the 9th sale will be on June 21st, so just 15 days from now. And that brings me to the meat of what I want to talk about, treasures from the Erivan collection. I think it's 9 items, if I recall, that are particularly special items that stood out to me while describing them, that I think have great backstories, they're visually appealing, just some things that I wanted to share with everyone, because I think that, these items obviously attracted Erivan Haub for a specific reason. And I think that same appeal that brought these covers all the way to Germany when he purchased them decades ago, is still very much palpable and living and breathing. So again, these are 9 items I picked out. Some of them are very valuable. Some of them are on the more common side, but certainly have great stories behind them. But I'm just going to share them with you one by one, and hopefully you find them as interesting as Mr. Haub and myself have. So to kick things off, I had to start with a Pony Express cover. This is a Pony Express cover sent to Scotland. So there's only a couple of hundred Pony Express letters to begin with. They are all very rare. They are all highly prized, but especially valuable and desirable are Pony Express letters sent outside of the United States. So like I said, this one is to Scotland. There are in total 6 Pony Express letters that left the United States. Give me 1 second. I'm just trying to get my notes called up here. As you can see, what I think makes this, I'm going to get to the Scotland connection in a second, but I think what makes this especially special is that that illustrated design in the upper left-hand corner. This is hand illustrated, so the design would have been, I'm sorry, hand colored. The design would have been printed. The horses, carrying the stagecoach would have been colored in. But this says overland via Los Angeles, which was an alternate route for mail to get from San Francisco, from the West Coast to the East Coast. The overland route was much longer, but also much cheaper. And these envelopes were printed so that people could direct their mail a certain way. What makes this incredible is that somebody took an overland via Los Angeles cover and actually used it on a Pony Express. They were using it on essentially a competing service, a quicker but more expensive service. So this is the only Pony Express cover that has that overland via Los Angeles directive, which I think is just incredible. Like I said, though, there are 6 Pony Express covers to foreign countries. These are Glasgow, Scotland, Liverpool, England, Prince Edward Island, France, Switzerland, and Germany. Mr. Haub owned 3 of the foreign Pony Express covers. Ironically, he never owned the one to Germany, his home country. I'm sure he would have loved to have gotten his hands on that one. This is dated November 7th, 1860, so relatively early in the lifespan of the Pony Express. It is the earliest international Pony Express cover. And again, I just think it's remarkable. You can only imagine what sort of business this contained, what was important enough to get to Scotland. You're saving a considerable amount of time, but it still has to get on a steamship on the East Coast and ultimately make it all the way to the United Kingdom. So I think this is just a great combination of beauty and rarity, and certainly a cover that Mr. Haub prized very much, and one that I'm sure will find a great home here in a couple of weeks. Next up is this. So whereas the other cover I think is beautiful in its own right, this cover is beautiful in how sort of primitive and crude it is. You can see this 5-line hand stamp in the upper left: Denver, Central Overland, California, and Pikes Peak Express. Jones and Russell were the 2 men who formed the Leavenworth and Pikes Peak Express in February of 1859. Their service began 2 months later in April of 59. In spring of 1859, though, there was a huge discouragement in the Pikes Peak region. The gold and silver that everybody thought would be flowing was drying up. It was not as profitable as people thought. So there was a lot of uncertainty in the region at the time. So mail was never the most profitable business, despite Jones and Russell essentially had a monopoly on service early on, but it never turned a profit because there just wasn't enough mail from Denver to points eastward for the company to be that viable. So the company was absorbed by Russell, Majors, and Waddell in late October of 1859. Those names will be familiar to anyone who knows their Pony Express history. And they continued to operate Jones and Russell's Express through February of 1860. In February of that same year, Russell, Majors, and Waddell formed the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company, which began they began their Pony Express operations in April of 1860. At the same time, though, they were running non-Pony Express operations, again, from the Pikes Peak region to points eastward. And this was the first hand stamp that they created for this newly named company that they formed. So you can see this would have been carved out of wood, basically using the materials at hand. It is a wonderful primitive device. Later on, you see hand stamps that are more in keeping with what you'd expect, the Jones and Russell's hand stamps here, for example. But I think this is just a great peek into, how you really had to make do with what you had if you were running an express company in the Pikes Peak region, in the 1860s. So again, wonderful cover in its primitive nature, and I think beautiful, in its own way, certainly. Continuing on with Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express, they created these advertising labels, basically. Encouraging people to direct their mail, care of this company. This was basically their way of promoting their services on the mail that they carried. These labels are incredibly rare. There's 4 of them known, 3 on pink paper or magenta paper, 1 on yellow paper. This one was used from Marshallton, Iowa, going westbound to Central City, Colorado, which was Kansas territory at the time. This was sent in late March 1861, just weeks after Abraham Lincoln's March 4th inauguration. You can see that the Lincoln patriotic design, the Lincoln campaign design on this cover still shows him as beardless. It was on October 15th, 1860, that an 11-year-old girl named Grace Bedell suggested to Abraham Lincoln that he grow a beard. I made a joke at WestPEX that I can really relate to Abraham Lincoln. When he wrote back to her, he said, "As to the whiskers, having never worn any, do you not think people would call it a silly affectation if I were to begin it now?" A lot of people who have seen me recently don't recognize me with the beard. So again, that's one regard in which Lincoln and I are sort of in the same boat. But again, here's one of these covers that has so much going for it. You've got the rare label, 4 of them known. You've got the incredible Abraham Lincoln, patriotic campaign illustration. You've got, just a westbound Central Overland and Pikes Peak cover is scarce in its own right. Again, there wasn't too much mail being sent by these companies. So this is an instance where everything just comes together. I think it is so much more than the sum of its parts. I think a cover like this is, a veritable work of art. It's a historical artifact that, should be celebrated even outside of Philately, because this is a perfect snapshot of what's going on in the country in those pivotal months right before the Civil War. And next up, I think this is the last Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company cover that I've got. If you can't tell, I'm a fan of these covers. This is an aspect of Philately that I really love, are these Western Express companies. What's interesting about this, though, is actually the addressee and the gentleman who sent the letter to him. So this is addressed to Heath Knuckles in Nebraska City, Nebraska territory. And there's an original letter included in it from a gentleman named Stephen Knuckles. Now, this isn't a name that was familiar to me. I did some research on Stephen Knuckles. What I found is he was born in Virginia. He moved to Missouri in 1846, didn't find any sort of business success there. So in 1854, he moved to Nebraska and founded Nebraska City, Nebraska, somewhere my fiance Olivia and I were lucky enough to travel. It's also the birthplace of Arbor Day, coincidentally. There's a big museum from the Morton Salt family, who were the founders of Arbor Day. So a lot of fun historical connections. He founded a bank in Nebraska City, served in the Nebraska Territorial Legislature, and actually brought the first 4 slaves to Nebraska, even though Nebraska was not a slave state. He brought 4 slaves there. 2 of them, a young woman named Celia and a woman named Eliza Grayson, escaped from his custody. He led a posse all the way from Nebraska City to Chicago to chase after his escaped slaves. With the help of a professional kidnapper, he found Eliza Grayson. I find it amusing that professional kidnapper was, apparently a job you could hold in Chicago in the 1850s. But both Knuckles and Grayson, the escaped slave, were imprisoned in Chicago. They were arrested, I think, with disturbing the peace, and both ended up in prison. An abolitionist mob broke Eliza Grayson out of the Chicago prison, helped her escape to Canada so that she was free from all of this nightmare. Knuckles escaped. He was given a disguise by a Chicago city councilman, returned to Nebraska, and I think was welcomed back with open arms. In 1860, he moved to Colorado to try his hand at more banking and mining. Moved to New York City in 1864, settled in Cheyenne in the Dakota Territory in 1867. And this is my favorite part of the story. So after he brings the slaves to Nebraska, he's arrested in Chicago, breaks out of jail after trying to, re-kidnap his slave. He was elected as a congressional delegate from Wyoming Territory in 1869. So even after all of this, he still ends up in Congress. I guess there's, Scott can probably speak to this more than anyone, but there's no sin that can't be forgiven in politics. And then he eventually moved to Salt Lake City, Utah. He opened a mill in 1872 and died in Salt Lake City in 1879. So here's a cover that otherwise would look unassuming, but the letter, which is a report from Stephen Knuckles to Heath Knuckles, reporting on his mining or his lack of success in Colorado, just opened up this whole can of worms and led me down one of the most fascinating rabbit holes that I've ever been down. Next up this is the cover from Fort Bridger, Utah Territory. This is a military postmark. There's, I believe, 3 examples of this postmark known, 2 of them on covers with 3-cent stamps, this one on a 3-cent Nesbitt envelope. This is one I wanted to include, basically just because I remember seeing this cover in an auction catalog that I was flipping through, and it looks so unlike any other postmarks of this era. This is from the late 1850s. It's just so striking and unusual compared to, we've seen all the circular and oval date stamps. We've seen manuscript postmarks. Here's one that looks like it was, almost press printed. So again, I was taken by this marking, sort of fell in love with it, but with only 3 of them in existence, you don't necessarily expect to see one every day. So a couple of months later, I'm over in Germany, picking up the next batch of material for the Erivan collection. And I'm flipping through a binder, and all of a sudden I open up to the page with this cover on it, the same cover I'd seen in that auction catalog. So this one's more of just a personal favorite for me. This is one that, again, I saw it in a catalog. I thought it was the coolest looking thing I'd ever seen. Never expected to hold it in my own hands. And now I'm fortunate enough to have, been its steward, been its curator for the last couple of months. Fort Bridger, really quick, was a trading post established by Jim Bridger in 1842. It was a vital resupply point along the California, Oregon, and Mormon trails. Military presence was established during the Utah War in 1858. It closed in 1890. Mail service was extremely unreliable, given skirmishes with both Native Americans and Mormons. And I just think that this cover is absolutely incredible. It would have been carried from Fort Bridger to Independence, and then from Independence to Richmond, Virginia. So just a personal favorite of mine that I had to include. Another phenomenally rare cover that I just absolutely love. This one is a cover that originated in Guatemala, because it's a folded letter, so you can still see that it was written in Guatemala. It was then carried to San Francisco by a Vanderbilt line steamer, as evidenced by the Via Nicaragua ahead of the mail's hand stamp, which I'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. But what's really special about this is that little stamp in the upper left. It says Reed's City Dispatch Post. Reed's City Dispatch Post was the first local post established in San Francisco. So the first independent mail operator to issue their own postage stamps on the West Coast of the United States. There's only 3 examples of the Reed's stamp known. One of them, this one, is on green paper. 2 of them are on blue paper. The 2 that are on blue paper are on locally addressed invitations, probably for a wedding or some sort of social gathering. So they were just carried within San Francisco. This one, again, the fact that it originated in Guatemala, was carried on a steamer to San Francisco, got the stamp, got the Adams Express Company hand stamp. Really, I think this is not just one of the greatest California covers in existence, but one of the greatest local post covers. This was discovered in a San Francisco warehouse in 1903. Someone was clearing out old paperwork and happened to have this. The only contemporaneous source that we have for Reed City Dispatch Post is an announcement. I'm sorry, there's two sources. The first is an announcement in the December 17th, 1853 Daily Alta, California newspaper. And then there was a small blurb in a city directory from 1854. So very short-lived. It was operated out of Adams and Company's office on Montgomery Street. The proprietor was named Henry Reed. When Adams went out of business in 1855, Reed's went with it. He tried to establish the ill-fated Penny Express Company shortly thereafter, and never really had luck in the express business or the local post business. So Henry Reed is sort of a warning story about what happened to many of the men who went to California in the 1840s seeking riches. The other thing I'll mention, though, is this Via Nicaragua ahead of the mail's hand stamp, which is a fascinating tale in and of itself. Cornelius Vanderbilt desired passenger and mail service across Nicaragua. All contract mail steamers operating, carrying mail for the U.S. government were crossing Central America via Panama. And Cornelius Vanderbilt thought that he could provide more efficient, quicker service if he crossed at Nicaragua. So he essentially opened a competing steamship route that people could opt to send their mail by. So if you sent a letter, the default was for it to go by Panama. But if you handed your letter directly to one of the steamships, or if you used a private company working with Vanderbilt, you could have your mail carried via Nicaragua instead of Panama. So the first trip via Nicaragua was in September of 1852. By 1855, William Walker, a very fascinating historical figure, essentially destabilized the country of Nicaragua, put an end to the route. The British got involved, the Americans got involved. It was a real mess, and Vanderbilt's experiment via Nicaragua fell apart very quickly. Even though it was providing fast service, it never could compete with the Panama route. And these hand stamps via Nicaragua ahead of the mails meaning it was faster than if you had sent your letter by U.S. mail. It was basically a means of propaganda and advertisement for Vanderbilt's line to let people know, hey, you can hand your mail to one of our steamships and we'll get it to the East Coast quicker than the U.S. government can. So again, a great combination of its origin in Guatemala, its rare local post stamp, the Via Nicaragua hand stamp, a lot going on with this cover, all of which makes it a truly remarkable item. Another great San Francisco cover. You can see here, I have got most enough. This is a minor, obviously a cartoonish depiction of a 49er in San Francisco. These minor covers were sort of analogous to patriotic covers during the Civil War. They were a way for people in California to let people on the East Coast know what they were up to, whether they had struck it rich or whether they were striking out, like the majority of people were. But what's special about this one is you can see from the imprint, it was printed by Noisy Carriers, located at 77 Long Wharf in San Francisco. Noisy Carriers is an incredibly important company from a postal history standpoint. It was founded by Charles Kimball, who arrived in San Francisco July of 1849, so a true 49er himself. 3 months later, Kimball and Company's Express carried mail and parcels between San Francisco and Sacramento by boat. This company failed. In February of 1850, he tried a city delivery service within San Francisco. This failed. He began collecting newspapers from the ships and carrying them through the streets of San Francisco, shouting the names and prices in rhyming verse, where they say he got his nickname from, Noisy Carriers, because he was carrying around the newspapers making a lot of noise. In September of 1850, he published a city directory for San Francisco. This also failed. So his mailboat service to Sacramento failed. His parcel delivery service within San Francisco fails. His directory fails. His newspaper business was all right, but he hadn't struck it rich like he was hoping, obviously. Finally, in the early 1850s, he opens a book, newspaper, stationery store, and publishing house at 77 Long Wharf. He operated a letter bag business where he would collect mail and carry it to steamships that were headed to the East Coast or headed to Central America, and the mail would continue on to the East Coast. Some of the mail went via the Panama post office route, much of the mail carried by Noisy Carriers went via that Vanderbilt, Nicaragua route. He started using propaganda hand stamps, noisy carriers. There's several designs of these, many of which are beautiful and quite rare, that would let people know, hey, you can leave your mail with Charles Kimball at Noisy Carrier, and he'll get it to the steamships for you. He created these illustrated letter sheets in minor envelopes as a way of promoting life in California in the early 1850s. Again, this is just a wonderful example. And this is the happy ending of the story. He became a very successful businessman. Noisy carriers took off. And by 1860, he was able to retire comfortably and live out the rest of his life in San Francisco. So a real rags to riches story, a 49er who didn't strike it rich mining for gold, but rather, selling these envelopes and carrying mail and performing all sorts of services to the people who were trying to start a new life for themselves in San Francisco. I've got two more here. This one, everyone I showed this to, I think it instantly becomes one of their favorite things they've ever seen. This is a burlap pouch that would have been wrapped around a cigarette case, most likely, that was carrying gold nuggets from California to the East Coast. So this is an actual gold pouch. One of the people who got lucky, in the mines. This was carried from Don Pedro's bar, which was it's now, I believe, underwater in Northern California. It got its name from a Don of Spanish descent. Some say he was from Mexico. Others say he was a Chilean. Long before the gold rush reached the area, he is said to have taken 7 or more donkey loads. The story increases every time it is told, of gold out of the area. And tales of a lost Spanish mine, presumed to be one of the richest in the state, go back to the days before the discovery at Sutter's Mill kicked off the gold rush. So Don Pedro's bar allegedly contained some of the richest gold mines in all of California. But of course, as is the case with many stories of lost gold, they have never been found. So let's talk about the rate here really quick. There are 10 10-cent stamps and 10 3-cent stamps for a total of $1.30 postage. Based on 10 cents per half ounce, this would have been about 6.5 ounces, again, including both the cigarette case it was carrying and the gold that was inside. And I will tell you that before it burnt down in 1864, Don Pedro Bar had about 1,500 residents. It was one of the richest mining areas in the world. But unfortunately, again, was burnt down in the 1860s, never rebuilt. And I believe they built a dam and flooded the area that was once home to this town. So again, here's a great item that really, I think, captures what the California gold rush was like, at least in the imaginations of many. Certainly not the reality for many people, but when it comes to postal history that transcends just stamp collecting, I don't know what's more romantic or impressive than a gold pouch carried from California to Maine in this case. And the last cover I'd like to talk about is this one. So like I said at the beginning, these are not necessarily the most expensive items. These aren't aren't all of the marquee items. But this is one that I just absolutely fell in love with when I first saw it. The town is called Big Bug, Arizona, which right there, that's as good as it gets for me. Nothing says, small podunk Wild West town like naming it Big Bug. So I started doing some research. I thought maybe there's a great story behind the name Big Bug. Every town's got its etymology. Big Bug has got to have some great story behind it. So Big Bug, the town in Arizona, was named after Big Bug Creek, which was named by a gentleman named John Marion in 1863, quote, because prospectors found numerous large bugs here. So there you go. All of my hopes for a great story were dashed when I found out that Big Bug was just named that because there were big bugs there. A historian wrote, these insects, which still abound, are large, dark brown, shiny flying beetles about the size of a walnut. So certainly an apt name for a town. The population hovered around 100 through the late 19th century. The Big Bug smelter operated between 1880 and 1890 and produced over $1 million worth of gold and silver. This is where the story gets interesting. The post office, and there's going to be a lot of dates here. I don't expect anybody to remember these, but I think it's a very interesting little story. The post office was established March 31st, 1879 as Big Bug, all one word, no space. 6 months later, in November of the same year, they changed it to Red Rock, Arizona. 18 months later, March of 1881, they changed it back to Big Bug, but this time 2 words with a space in the middle. And then about 14 years later, in 1895, they changed it back to the original Big Bug with no space. So this cover here is from the Big Bug spaced 2-word era, as you can see from both hand stamps. And then the post office closed permanently at the end of March 1910. Why do I want to talk about Big Bug, though? It is because of a man named Theodore Boggs. This is one of those larger-than-life Western characters that I just absolutely love reading about. Theodore Boggs was the son of a former governor of Missouri. He was allegedly a great-grandson of Daniel Boone. He, again, none of this is verifiable. This is all what Theodore Boggs told people later in life, but I'm gonna quote him. He alleged to have traveled with the Donner Party when he was 10 years old and their ill-fated trip through the Sierra Nevadas. In 1862, he left California for Arizona and settled along Big Bug Creek. Boggs and 3 companions carved out a home from a mountainside and mined the area for gold and silver. So he and his 3 buddies basically form a cabin for themselves, carved into the side of a cliff. It was a little bit outside of the town of Big Bug. So I can only imagine the people in town thought he was maybe a bit eccentric for living in a mountainside, but he and his 3 buddies lived a short distance out of town. One evening, they heard a dog crying outside, one of their pet dogs. They look out the window. The dog has an arrow sticking out of its side. There were Apache Indians on top of the cliff above their cabin, and they started rolling boulders down the mountainside, trying to crush the 4 men inside of their home. 2 of the men held the roof of the house up over their heads to keep it from caving in. They used a bed frame to prop the roof up. Boggs and the 4th man grabbed their rifle. They dug, as they described, small portholes out of the rubble and fired, killing 2 of the Apaches who were on top of the mountain. The Apaches recovered their dead, retreated, cremated the bodies in full sight of the 4 men in their dilapidated cabin, and then left, never to bother Mr. Boggs and his companions again. Now, again, there is no evidence of this story. It has been called the Battle of Big Bug as part of the Indian wars that were being fought. There's no documentation of this quote unquote battle or skirmish outside of Mr. Boggs's account of it. You wonder if maybe there was a mishap that resulted in an avalanche crushing their home, and he had to come up with this wonderful story in order to explain it to the townsfolk. But again, Big Bug, it's got a great name. It's got a great backstory. It's one of those covers that I think is just so indicative of the American West. These are the stories that captivated Erivan Haub. They're the stories that have captivated myself and my team, and hopefully, being able to share a couple of them with you tonight has, also gotten you thinking about the Wild West and some of the more romantic aspects of American postal history. So that does it. I want to thank everyone again for attending and joining us here tonight. And only took 41 minutes, so I've got time for a couple of questions, Scott, if that's all right with you.
Charles, I got a couple on the presentation, then I've got some more general questions. So we'll start with the presentation questions first.
Perfect.
What was the rate of the Via Nicaragua Reads Local Post cover? Is there a rate marking on that cover?
So mail, I'm going to share my screen again to call it back up, if that's okay. Give me 1 second to get it. Since Vanderbilt was essentially operating without a U.S. contract, his mail was carried outside of the U.S. mails. So I don't know off the top of my head what rate Vanderbilt himself would have charged. I assume it was comparable to the then contemporaneous U.S. rates. From Guatemala at that time, I'm sure 1 or 2 people listening can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it was a 20-cent rate if it was from the west coast of Guatemala. East coast of Guatemala might have been a 30-cent rate, but probably 20 cents. But it doesn't have a U.S. rate marking because this cover never entered the United States Post Office stream. This was sent, again, under Vanderbilt ship from Guatemala to San Francisco. As soon as it got there, it made it to Adams Express Company and Reed City Dispatch Post, who carried it to its recipient. So this cover was carried basically the whole way outside of the U.S. mails.
Okay. I actually have another cover related question for you. The Big Bug cover,
Yes.
why was the registered contracted as registered with the apostrophe D rather than just fully spelling out the registered?
Um, this is a question that I couldn't have answered before, and I think I saw him in the chat here. Gentleman came up to me after this talk at WestPEX and explained to me that they were trying. I know it's gonna take a second, but I think it's important to call the cover up now that I know the answer to this. So the story I heard, and I did a bit of research, and it seems to check out, is that they wanted the postmark to essentially be the same length on the top and bottom lines. So they used this apostrophe rather than an E as a way of trying to get the Big Bug AT and registered to line up with one another. And they didn't take into account the fact there was going to be a numeral sign for the registered number, which totally threw off their symmetry. But that's the story I've heard, and I think it's as great a story as any. So again, it was an attempt to make the top and bottom lines the same length, and then all of that was thrown out the window with the use of the hashtag. So that's the story. I don't think there's any way we can be positive one way or another. So I like that story, and I'm going to keep telling it.
Well, balance on a cover is a perfectly philatelic answer to it. So if it's not the right answer, it's a darn good one. So we'll go with that.
Exactly. Again, it's the best we've got. None of us were in Big Bug in 1884.
How much of the information comes from the collection, and how much do you have to research on your own?
Sure. So it depends on, Mr. Haub was buying a lot of things at auction. So when you're buying at auction, you've got a description to work with. So a lot of times there is a jumping off point for us. A lot of this material, though, he was acquiring from sources that maybe we don't even know, dealers and collectors who didn't want to be identified. So a lot of these things come to us with absolutely no information. It's up to us to figure out what the markings are, what the rate was, what the route was, how the cover was carried, who carried it. So it really depends. Sometimes we've got a lot of background research that's been done for us, and then it's just up to us to fill in the gaps and sort of massage that into a good story. Whereas other times we're starting from complete scratch and have to reconstruct the history of the cover ourselves. So it all depends. Some of these covers were neatly mounted on exhibit pages that he had a dealer make for him. Others were loose in shoe boxes. Some of them were mounted on album pages from the 1950s. I'm not sure anybody's looked at them, in the decades since. So it's all over the map with a collection like this. But we always, even if the story of a cover has been told, even if it had appeared at auction relatively recently, we like to always find some historical details, some little bit of trivia that we can add to it to, really put our own spin on our descriptions.
Well, I mean, talking about that, Charles, so the one of the questions that I often get asked, and you probably can answer it far better than I can, and that is, what are the starter tips when you're doing research for postal history, particularly? What are the starter tips? Where do I begin my journey to get to the answers?
There's a great column I'll get to that in a second.
We'll get to that.
No, so this is something that I think is very important because one of my frustrations with philately, and I've said this to a lot of people. So if you're listening and you've heard this before, I apologize. But if you're a beginning collector, if you when I started buying stamps on eBay for the first time, you're buying 100 stamps for $1 or whatnot. There's a lot of resources for beginners. There's a lot of ways for people to get their foot in the door and, learn what country different stamps are from. You learn the way to use hinges. You learn what mounts to use. There's a huge wealth of resources for beginners. And if you're an advanced postal historian, you're probably a member of the Classic Society. You're a member of a state postal history society. You're a member of the Carriers and Locals Society. There's resources for the people who are very far into the weeds, maybe, in my case, sometimes too far into the weeds. There are resources for either extreme. The beginners and the experts each have material that caters to them. I've always felt like there's a huge opportunity to appeal to the middle, to connect point A to point B, to turn stamp collectors into postal historians. So there are some wonderful books. There's a book on the Pony Express that was written by Steve Walski, Richard Fajola, and George Kramer. I think that is one of the easiest books to read in terms of philatelic, monographs. That's one that not only is a great technical resource, but also, again, you can sit down and read that one, and it reads like a coffee table book. So there are some books out there. The Classic Society is the one society I would recommend joining if you're, other than the APS, if you're ready to take that jump from stamp collector to postal historian. But as I alluded to, I'm going to get my shameless plug out of the way here. In the May issue of the American Philatelist, I started a monthly column called The Letter Opener. My goal is to take one postal history concept each month. This June issue, it is freight money letters, which is such a confusing and difficult concept to learn. It's one that took me months to fully wrap my head around, and I'm not gonna share any of the details here because you can go read that column in the June AP. But my goal with this column is to be that helping hand, to be that bridge between entry-level collectors and the very, very advanced students of postal history. So if anybody ever wants book recommendations, if you've got a cover that you can't crack the code on, always feel free to send me an email. My team and I are very happy to point you in the right direction. But I mean, I was on Twitter last night trying to break down a route on a cover from Peru to New York City, because it had a very strange route on it that took me a little while to figure out. And I figured I would take everyone else on that journey with me. So I think it's an area where there's been some great research, some great writing done, some great, resources made available. But I think there's a lot more work to be done on teaching people the basics of postal history.
Well, I was going to get to the letter opener and say that, fundamentally one of the things that we strive to do is bring useful information and how to take that journey when you're doing research into various aspects of philately. And so I appreciate you stepping up and taking over, taking on this mission of doing that for postal history. The title is very clever of the column, Charles. I'm just curious, were there other titles considered?
There was. My first choice was Charles Epting covers, which I thought was a fun play on words. I am very fortunate that Susanna Mills stepped in and talked me out of that one. And I think The Letter Opener is a fantastic title. She sent me a whole list, and she and I both agreed that was the one. So fortunately the world was spared of Charles Epting covers.
Well, for those of us who are a little grayer in this in this discussion tonight, we can have faith that two younger members of the philatelic community do carry some wisdom with them. And so I do like The Letter Opener. I think it's an excellent choice. And I congratulate both you and Susanna for making that happen. I've got another presentation oriented question for you. Are you aware of how many gold pouches were mailed? Was the one you showed a one of a kind, or is it more common at that time?
So I haven't seen many, if any, other examples myself. I can imagine these were, well, on the one hand, you would think that people were trying to, mail their gold to the East Coast to, either prove their wealth, prove their discoveries, or just to get it to a bank or a family member. But there would have been other more secure ways of doing it. Certainly I wouldn't trust solid gold nuggets with the United States Postal Service today, let alone in the 1850s. So no, this is not something you come across very often. I think it's an extraordinary artifact. Also, you would imagine that 99.9% of the time when somebody got their gold pouch in the mail, they were more excited about what was inside of it than keeping what was wrapped around it. So I would guess that the lion's share of these gold pouches were thrown away as soon as they arrived. I think the contents were much more interesting to people.
Well, I find that shocking, but I'm sure you're probably right about that. Here's another interesting research question, so I'll pose it to you. From a research perspective, is there an advantage to having the letter inside when a cover is desired? Is it completely different to deal with the letter itself, or to collect the letters in the envelope, the cover and the letter together?
That's a great question. Certainly from a research perspective, we always love when there's a letter contained within the envelope. Fortunately for the early part, sort of first half of the 19th century, envelopes weren't really a thing. You would write on a piece of paper, fold it up, and send that through the mail because Postage rates were charged based on the number of sheets rather than the weight. So using an envelope would just be unnecessarily costing yourself money. So in that case, it's very useful to have the contents more often than not written directly on the folded letter. When it comes to envelopes, though, when you get into the middle and later parts of the 19th century, that knuckles cover, for example, without the contents, I would have known, it was addressed to this Heath Knuckles, but I never would have known that it was from his brother Stephen, this incredibly interesting and really awful historical figure. That's an instance where the fact that it was signed from Stephen really opened up all sorts of avenues for research that we wouldn't have otherwise had. Sometimes the letter will tell you, the contents of the letter will tell you where it was sent from. So right now we're dealing with a collection of ship mail entered the United States via ship at a port of entry. And what's great about a lot of these letters is they would write their latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates on the letter. They'd say, I'm at sea, latitude, blah, 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 longitude. So you'd know exactly where the ship was at the time they wrote their letter. That's something that would be completely lost if the letter and envelope were divorced from one another. So, certainly the main interest in postal history are the postmarks, the rates, the routes, the stuff on the outside of the envelope. But when you start combining that with social history and when you start contextualizing postal history, within the larger framework of American history, the contents just add so much to the story. And I think that's a trend that will continue, that people value what's inside just as much as what's outside.
I'm going to get in trouble if I don't ask this question, so I have to go ahead and do it. Charles, this is interestingly enough, this is a question I get at almost every AMA and Stamp Chat that we have done in 2023. So I'm going to pose it to you and let you answer the question. When will we see more conversations with philatelists?
I think you might get this question more than I do. Even you probably see more people than I do. So yeah, conversations with philatelists, with Michael Cortese and myself, was so much fun during the pandemic. We were both cooped up at home, dying to go to shows, dying to see collectors, and that was a great weekly way for us to keep in touch with people and share that with the world. It is both a blessing and a curse that things have opened up again, because Michael and I are now trying to run our respective businesses. We're traveling to meet consigners, we're going to shows. And whereas we used to have all the time in the world on our hands, we're both busier than ever. Michael is still an incredibly dear friend. I'm seeing him tomorrow, actually. I'm going to be in Concord, New Hampshire. So we always talk about, getting it back up off the ground. My goal, and hopefully Michael doesn't mind me saying this, I think that the weekly format was a bit tough to keep up, both finding people and finding the time to do it. So what I would love to do is see CWP maybe morph into something that is less frequent but with a higher production value, rather than just he and I blabbering on in front of our computer screens. Doing more stuff at shows, doing more stuff in person on the road. I think it would be fun to sort of have a CWP 2.0. That again trades the frequency for the production value. I apologize that people won't get it once a week, but I think that we could give people something that is more rewarding and more lasting than he and I getting frustrated over NFTs or fake postage stamps or something.
Well, and I do want to draw attention to the fact it's not exactly like you're living in a content-free world. I mean, you and your team are doing some promotions, and you want to share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to Allison Sullivan and Alyssa Baumgartner, both of whom were listening when it started. I can't see if they're still here, but I'm gonna assume they are.
They're still here.
Okay, perfect. And the three of us have really tried to bring some new life to the auction business. I think this is an industry that is I hate to say it, but it's stagnant in a lot of ways. A lot of things are being done the same way they were done, 30, 40 years ago. And Alyssa just commented that she's here. Thank you. Here you've got the three of us, all young professionals, all coming at this without, I think it's one thing. We don't have a lot of the perspective or baggage, which Scott, I said this to a group of people. You were in the room a couple of days ago. Coming at this without any of the perspective is both a blessing and a curse. It means I, maybe don't, maybe I don't have the experience that others have, but at the same time, I can also look at things with a fresh set of eyes, and don't have the biases or the complacency that maybe people develop after decades in this industry. So long story short, this has manifested itself in a lot of social media and YouTube videos that we've been trying to put out. I look at the way coin companies and rare book companies are using social media to get people excited, get people interested, tell little stories. And I think it's a shame more people in stamps aren't doing that. So it's something we feel very strongly about. Whenever we travel, I always try and, I'll mention my fiance, Olivia, again, we always try and work some philatelic, tourism into our travels, whether it's the end of the Santa Fe Trail when we were in New Mexico, the start of the Pony Express in Sacramento when we were there for Great American Stamp Show last year. I think it's fun to get on the road, visit these places, tell little stories, and share them with the world. When we've got an auction coming up, the three of us, Allison, Alyssa, and myself, hop on YouTube and do a live stream. We each pick our favorite item from the sale. So I think it's just our way of trying to bring a new, fresh perspective. Certainly there's something to be said for the printed auction catalog. There's something to be said for the way things have been done for a long time. But I think that can be supplemented and augmented with these new technologies and these new ways of reaching people. And I can tell you our videos and our press releases to mainstream press have resulted in some wonderful realizations at auction. There have been people who saw a video and picked up a new collection from that. So I think that it's working. I think that it's hopefully starting to excite people and rejuvenate people.
Look, I've said this a lot, and so I concur wholeheartedly with what you said. I mean, the experiential side of the hobby really needs to be explored out as much as it can be, and I think it needs to be conveyed to a broader audience. Being around stamp collectors is fun. You and I spent the weekend together at Apex, and we got to see a wide variety of people. But at the end of the day, those connections are incredibly important in the enjoyment of the hobby. And so, but it's a 24/7 world now, and that's a way that I think that what you're bringing to the table is incredibly valuable. So I appreciate you doing that.
I'm the most important thing is Allison, Alyssa, Olivia, myself. We're all having a lot of fun doing it. I think that's what keeps it hopefully fresh and exciting. Is it's one of the most fun parts of our job, to speak directly to collectors and non-collectors alike. I think that's it's just very rewarding. So we love it, and we're going to keep it up for as long as we can.
That's fantastic. I'm happy to hear that. Well, I always make a promise. We go a 60-minute slot, and that's it. There's so much more you and I could talk about, and hopefully maybe we can get you back on again sometime soon.
Absolutely. And I'll be seeing you in just over a week, I think, as well.
Yes, you will be attending summer seminar here at the American Philatelic Society. And for those of you who will be joining us for summer seminar, you'll get to meet Charles in person. If not, I know he'll be in Cleveland as well for the Great American Stamp Show. So make your plans.
Scott, thank you very much for setting this up. I had a lot of fun. If anyone wants to get a hold of me, I'm not hard to find. Just C Epting at hrharmer.com. First initial, last name at hrharmer.com, or you can find me variously on our website. I think APS's website somewhere. So feel free to reach out. I'd love to hear any other feedback you have.
Absolutely. Charles, thanks. Thank you so much for this. It's a fascinating presentation. If you want to stay up to date with Charles and what's going on with the Erivan Collection, among other things, you can visit their website at hrharmer.com. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe to the APS YouTube page for all of our future stamp chats. This has been recorded in total, and it will go live very soon. So if you did not see the full presentation, you'll be able to. If you're not a member of the APS, why not? We'd love to have you as part of our stamp community. For more information, visit us at stamps.org. Thank you for joining us.